that this is a very beautiful story shared a few minutes ago, and Rona, we are still living in your story.
Thank you.
But now, please let me introduce you. It's Geetanjali Shetty Kaul. And Geetanjali, please introduce yourself fully. Tell us about your work, and please tell us a story.
Yeah, this is Geetanjali Shetty Kaul. I'm an educator and I'm a storyteller for 5 years now. But my primary interest is education, which has been in my biodata for 23 years now. And I love building a community of storytellers. I also run a course so that I meet more tellers, people who are eager to tell stories, and we honor their art of telling stories as well. So I'm quite impressed with Eric, who's bringing this community of storytellers together through the Chennai Storytelling Festival, and thanking you for giving us the space every weekend. Thank you. So I start with my story. Mine is a personal narrative. It's my own story, and I'm ready to share here. Thank you so much. So once when my daughter was around 7, 8 years old, I was sitting under a flowering tree with her in a park. She looked around at the leaves and the twigs that were fallen and the flowers that were fallen, and she said, "Mama, tell me a story." So I looked at her intently and said, "Yes, here goes the story. Once there was a priest who looked at the disciples and said, 'Go get some flowers to offer to God.' All the disciples, they ran to get flowers. 3 of them returned with a basket full of flowers, and one of them took a long time to return. He was hungry and thirsty. When he returned, there was only one flower in the basket, to which the priest asked, 'What took you so long?' So the disciple said, 'When I went to the garden and I looked at the flowers, I saw all of them were busy praying, and I didn't want to disturb them. I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And then I found this one flower. It's just finished its prayer now.' The priest smiled and he took that flower from the disciple's hand. And that was the first flower he offered to God that evening. To this, my daughter looked around under the flowering tree and she said, 'Yeah, it just looks like all of them are busy praying. Which one to pick up?' She went dodging here, dodging there, and then she picked up one flower and she came to me and said, 'Mama, this one is for you. It's a blessing, you see.' I took the flower in my hand and I looked at her and said, 'You sounded just like my amma, my granny. She would do this to me so often.' My daughter once again sat next to me and said, 'Mama, tell me a story of your amma.' I said, 'Yeah, my granny.' So my amma was 4.9 feet tall, and she would often wear cotton saris. She had gray hair, which she would neatly tie up in a bun, and she loved jasmine flowers stringed into a garland around that bun. She wore a red bindi, green bangles. She had watery eyes, thin lips, and lots of love on that face, wrinkles on her face. And her palm, which I loved touching, was so soft. And her veins were my pastime because I used to love feeling them all the time. I'll tell you a day. I think I would tell you most often these evenings when I went to her to the temple. And when we entered the temple, she would wait for a flower to fall. And she would pick it up and give it to me and say, 'This one is for you. It's a blessing.' And I would take it to school the next day. We also had a ritual whenever we visited a temple to sit there down in silence. She said, 'In silence, God speaks to me.' I think these were my first moments of meditation. Outside that temple, there was a tree, a huge tree, which she worshipped, and I stood next to her. She said all trees have wisdom inside them, and when you pray, a bit of their wisdom comes to you. I held my granny hand and I would come home. Every evening, my granny would churn the butter from the curd and tell me a Kannada parable, and then sing a Kannada melody. She had incredible ears, you see. Whenever I would tell her my problems, she would hear it deeply and then tell me a story. I was blessed to have Amma in my life. Fast forward, when I was a teenager, I had difficulties with my friends. I would come home there in her cotton sari, sitting, lighting a lamp. She had a story to tell. I still remember when I was 22 and I was amidst my career breaks and heartbroken as well at the same time. I walked upstairs to my granny house and my Amma heard me intently and said, "This evening we'll go to the temple." And we prayed and a flower fell and she gave it to me. Said, "This is going to be a blessing for you." It was indeed a good luck, most miraculous day of my life. I found my career that day. Fast forward 3 months before my wedding. I walk up to my granny. I sit next to her. She was sick that day. She had herpes. I looked into her eyes and said, "It must be paining, right?" She looked at me and said, "It pains, but I'm waiting eagerly for your wedding." And this thought is so comforting that I can handle any pain at this time. On my wedding day, she was the happiest of all. She did my kanyadan. She gifted me a carrot color sari. She was just blessing me every moment. And she said, "Take care of your in-laws. Think whenever you serve them food, you're serving it to me." That's what I did post my wedding, busy taking care of my in-laws. 3 months after my wedding, I was in Pune. I rarely called her. And I remember this night when I was sleeping, I saw a woman in my dreams entering my room. She was dressed in a white robe, she had long hair. She walked towards me as if she wanted to tell me something. The moment she came closer, I was sweating and I woke up from my dream. Everything was just there, the door, the bed, me, my husband, but the woman wasn't there. I didn't sleep after this dream. The next night, once again in my dream, I saw this woman entering from the same door. She walked towards me as if she wanted to tell me something. She came closer. I was sweating. I woke up from my dream. The third night, I felt it was a recurring dream and I just didn't want to sleep, but it was just a moment that just glanced by and I went off to sleep. When I saw her coming and walking towards my husband, I felt a strange separation happening when she went close to my husband. I was sweating and I woke up from my dream. And this time I woke my husband and I told him, "I'm not going to sleep here anymore. I'm going to go. I'm scared." Next day, I packed my bag and I left for Mumbai. That's the place I grew up in. I have no memories of how I actually landed into my granny house. I walked upstairs and I walked into the house and there I saw my granny, not dressed in a sari, no red bindi, no neatly tied bun. Instead, she was sick. She was wearing a gown, her hair haggard, no bindi, and she was sitting with her head like this on her hand. She was waiting, breathing for oxygen. She was asthmatic. And I was told she had just returned from the hospital. She was so happy to see me. It was just eyes filled with love. And all I wanted to see was my Amma, my granny. That night I slept next to her. She tossed and turned. Next morning, I was getting dressed for a meeting. In that state of despair, she wanted to check if I'm going to come home for lunch. I said, "I'm not sure." When I was leaving, my help came and said, "She's not had food for a very long time. Why don't you feed her?" I sat and I took this ganji. Ganji is this cooked rice, in starch that we feed when someone is not well, when people are sick. So I began feeding my Amma. And she refused. So I said, "See, I want to see you again, okay, in your sari, in your red tika, and I want to see that mogra flower behind. And I want to see you again, Amma, praying here near the altar." And she began eating morsel by morsel. While I was feeding her, I just went back to my own yesterdays, to my own days when I was young and I was sick, and she would feed me ganji. and the food was, she was done with the meal. It was over. I saw a smile on her face, and she slept on the bed. And once again, I took her hand and I began playing with her veins, and I looked at her. She was smiling. And that hand slipped my hand. She passed away. I couldn't believe it. It was just a moment ago that she was there. She had a wonderful memory. She probably would have told me many more stories. She probably would have heard many more tales that were going to come in my life. She was gone. And I felt that emptiness, that void that happened at that moment. As though everything was over, everything was dark. And the feeling that I was never going to see her again was killing me. She was not going to be there in this house was killing me. That evening, they dressed her up and I screamed, Amma. And she wore a green sari. She had a mogra flower behind on a bun. The red tika, the Mangal Sutra, green bangles, and she was glowing. I must tell you, the most beautiful woman on earth at that point of time for me was my Amma. I was searching for her everywhere, just couldn't find her. And it was this one evening that I decided to go to that temple. And I picked up a flower that fell. I walked to that tree which she worshipped. And I sensed her around. And I remembered all those wisdom stories that she's ever told me. As I opened my eyes, I saw a flock of birds flying up in the sky as if she was free in this world and I could meet her whenever I want. Yes, my grandma was there in these flowers, in these trees, in this nature around. And that kind of gave me a feeling that my Amma lives in me. And I love to share, I love to give. And this was the blessing that my grandma always gave me. After listening to my story, my daughter stood up. I told her, yeah, you were born after a year. And I held your hand. She picked up each and every leaf fallen there carefully, a twig carefully, and a flower carefully, and she put it in her bag. We came home quietly, and she decorated it on a nature table, and we silently sat there for a while. That's my story. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, there's just silence after the story is being told.
Well, I'm thinking about death and the death of people I've known, and as you've communicated how incomprehensible it is that someone is there and then they're not there anymore.
And actually, after she passed away, and all of our relatives and all came from our native place, and from my brother came from abroad, and they were all surprised to even to think that I was there at this moment because I don't live there, and how everything just fell in place. For me to be next to her while she was passing away. So it's all destiny, like who's going to be around whom at what point of time.
So now you carry your grandmother within you.
Yes, and it is very, so I run this organization, you know about it. It's called The Secret Passages. And the first time I discovered the Secret Passage meditation, I strangely had my grandmother in the temple. And I told people, let's walk towards that temple. Inside that temple, there is an old woman who's sitting. She's dressed up in a green sari, 4.9 feet tall, watery eyes, thin lips, gray hair, and she's got wrinkles on her face, and she's got seeds of hope, belief, truth, and love, which she gives you and says, go sow them, let them grow. I was surprised how my granny came in my meditation, and Secret Passage meditation has been one of the ways how we've touched so many storytellers, and I'm so sure that they are also spreading this meditation in their own spaces. Yeah, so she comes, she's in my life all the time.
Lovely. Yeah, beautiful. I am a grandma. I have 6 grandchildren, and I know that the one thing they will miss when I go is the stories. So I tell my children all the time, don't forget the stories.
But it's so strange that like what Eric was also saying, that a moment a death happens, you actually feel it's all gone, it's all washed away. And you feel so much of void and emptiness. You actually don't think it's going to return, even the stories. And then when you start picking up, moment to moment, you feel that how each story and each flower is leaving its fragrance behind. And then you know which story to tell.
Yes, beautiful.
Yes, Nivedita.
Probably you know this, I've shared in one of the workshops. But this is a small thing with my grandmother. My parents were building career, they were too busy, earning. And here I was left with my grandmother, who had very severe arthritis, so she could not walk. She could only, move on her bum. And I would run to this nearest library. I could not read Kannada, and she could read only Kannada. And whichever thing appealed to me, 2 books were to be bought. One book which she would read, her this thing. Other book would be a children's story book which she would read for me and tell me eventually. So my storytelling person was my grandmother. Every night dinner time was when she told. And I think that stage of life, I needed her more than my parents. And she was there to listen to me after the school, all my fights and all my things. And the whole day, patra, ajji. And she had all the years to listen. But then came a phase in life when my father was transferred to Chandigarh, and it was in the midst of Khalistan movement, and he could not take my grandmother. It was decided she would go to my uncle's house, and here were 2 bonds, unfortunately, where I was pushed into the train which I refused to take because I didn't want to part with her. I was just bundled up and put in, and I still remember, I can't share this story without tears in my eyes. I still remember calling out from that window, asking her that she would meet me. Promise you would meet me. And 1 year later, she expired. I could never meet her in my life. And today, trying to be a storyteller, pass on her stories, her message. Sorry.
We were blessed to have grandparents in our life.
Well, Geetanjali, you've put us in a mood.
Healing mood.
Yes. Wonderful mood. Okay, thank you so much, Geetanjali.